Okay, so I am going to use MVVM, but I'm not going to use coordinator pattern. That seems like overkill because we're actually not going to be navigating between screens. All I've done is just stuck main in my clock view group here, and I'll use that as my storyboard for that. And then um, I've got a model group. That's all I've built so far. So let's start with our model because our model is going to be the data we're going to use. And for our purposes, I'm just going to make a class called clock. And we're going to make a very simple class called the clock class. And it's going to have a static variable that is the current time. And what we want from this variable is actually I'm going to use it to return. It's gonna be of type closure that returns a string every time this variable is referenced. It's gonna sort of remake the string for the current time. So let's get access to the current day, which we do this way, and then we want to pull out certain parts of the day. So for instance, we're going to say let hours equal calendar dot current dot components from, we're going to do the dot hour component from today. That looks good. Okay. And then let's do let minutes equal basically the same thing. Dot minutes. And then finally, oh, you know what? That's going to return an integer. And if we're going to display a clock nicely, we kind of want our minutes to always be more than one decimal point, kind of, having the zero if we're for a single digit. So let's go ahead and make a minute string. And that's just going to be equal to, we'll use the string initializer and then pass in our own format. In this case, we're going to use the 2 decimal point format, and the string we're going to be targeting, or the value we're going to be targeting, is minutes. Minute should be turned into a string using excellent. Okay. And then finally, we need to do seconds, which is also going to be equal to calendar current component from second from today. And we want to do the same thing with our seconds for their string. So we'll do second string and set that equal to a string of that with its 2 decimal points. And finally, this is looking for me to return a string. So we're going to return the hours with a colon, then we're going to return minute string. Then we're going to return second string. All right. And there's our data. So this is a function really that's going to be called every time this is referenced. And then it's going to produce a new string based on today. Okay, now let's do sort of our MVVM, which means we're going to we have our view, we need a model, we need a view, we have our model, we need our view model, and we need our controller. which is our controller is really going to represent in combination with the storyboard our view. So we're going to do this. We're going to say this is going to be clock view model, where all our data and business logic should be taking place. And then finally, we're going to do a clock view controller. And I like my stuff organized like that. Okay, in our storyboard here, let's go ahead and set this up a little bit. So we're going to have a vertical stack outlined. I'm just going to pin it to the sides of the view here. So 0, 0, 0, 0. And then I'm just going to pop in 3 labels. Label 1, label 2, label 3. I'm going to come over to stack view, and I'm going to have stack view go ahead and fill it all equally. And I'm going to have the labels just center themselves. I want to make sure that my view controller, my view here is tied to the right view controller, which it's not yet. I actually want it tied to clock view controller. And I should be able to come over here. Let's see. Let me just do it this way. Okay. And I'll tie each one. So I'm going to hold down Control, drag it over. We'll call this a closure time label. We'll call this one the observable time label. And these are the 3 ways I want to do their binding today. And then finally, nope, that's not right. We're going to do our combine time label. So we're going to do it via closure. We're going to do it via making our own observable type, and then we're going to do it via the combine library. Okay, that should take care of our storyboard, so we don't really need to touch that again. I'm going to go ahead actually and run this. Just see if we have any issues. But that should all run. Make sure the labels come up. Do not run this on iPod Touch 7. Go ahead and run this on an iPhone 12. Here we go. Let's see. Good. Okay, no problems. So let's start with just our closure type. So to do this, we want to set up our view model, and we want to make sure we have reference to our view model here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just plan out the basics of my view model here. So class clock view model. And again, this is where all my data is really going to be held. So when we're doing a closure, we need to have some function that's going to be called when the time does change. So we're going to set that here. We're going to say var did change time, and that is going to be closure type, and it's going to pass a clock view model, and it's going to return void. And you're going to want this to be optional. And then we need to set up the actual variable for closure time. So closure time is going to be of type string. And we want to make sure that whenever it's set, so did set, meaning whenever it changes, go ahead and call the function did change time and make sure we're passing in a version of ourself, meaning the clock view model. It's saying we have no initializers, which is true, and we never really initialize closing time. So let's go ahead and initialize. We'll write a quick initializer. We'll say closure time is equal to, and we want to access that clock class we just made, and we want to access the current time. Now this will just get it once. We're going to have to set up a way for our clock to keep checking the time to make sure we're updating these values in our view model, not just in our model. We want to update them in our view model. So I'm going to also write in a function here. Actually, no, I don't think it needs to be Objective-C, actually. I think we can just write a check time function. And all this is going to do is this is going to, when it's called, it's going to go ahead and update our time. Okay. And that, I think, is good for our closure here. Let's go into our view controller for a second and figure out how this is going to be displayed. So we're going to need a few things in our view controller to do our closure binding. First off, we're going to need access to our view model. So let's do that first. Let's say var view model is equal to a clock model initialized. Good. And then let's put up a function. And this function is going to start a timer. And I want to start this timer here in our view controller, just to make sure that it's tied to when the view controller actually, when this view actually loads. So you might have this actually in your view model. That'd be another way of doing it. I'm just going to put it here. I want it to update every second. I want it to repeat. And all I want it to do is call the view models dot check time. Okay. So now we have the time updating. Well, this should be a self. Good. Now we have the time updating. We need to bind the time. So here we're going to make a new function called, put an extra space there, set bindings. Not going to take any values. And for our binding, all we want to do is say view model did change time. And we're going to actually set that function now. Now, it's important in this closure that we make sure we don't produce a retain cycle. So we want to make sure that Swift knows that this is an unowned version of self. And the self is the view model. Well, the self is actually, in this case, the view controller, but it has access to the view model from when we set it up in the view model. And we're going to say self dot closing time label dot text is going to be equal to the view models, the one passed in here, right, as self closure time. And this is just a reference to the self that we passed in right here. Okay. All right. That should bind our clock time with our label here. And let's, oh, nope. You know why I didn't? Because two things I didn't do. When view loaded, I forgot to set my bindings and I forgot to start my timer. Okay. Now we should see the time change. There we go. Okay, so that's a binding done with closure. So what's happening here is in the view model, time is updating due to the timer in the view controller. Again, that could be probably even makes more sense to be stored in the view model, but we we did it in the view controller, fine. And that's causing our time to update. Because of the closure binding, it's updating the view here on the label. So that's how you would do a closure binding. Now we're going to do a binding that involves producing your own observable object. So I'm going to make a new file. Let's just make it inside a clock for now. We might store it in production. You might store it somewhere in like a utilities folder or utilities group or something like that, but we're going to store it in just outside. Okay, now observable has to be able to take really any type. And the way you do that is you do these angle brackets type like that. That's how you kind of start that class off. Now, the important thing about an observable is it's going to have reference to a listener. That listener is going to be listening for changes. And that listener should take whatever the generic type is that our observable is for, or wrapping around, right? This is like a wrapper. And it should return void. And it needs to be optional. Now, we also need our observable to have a value because that's basically what we're going to be looking and watching for a change on. And we want to make sure that if it's set, if the observable is set, we're going to go ahead and call our listener, passing it value. And our listener is optional, so we just want to do that chaining there. When we initialize our observable, we want to make sure we initialize it with some value. Again, it's going to be of that generic type T. And we're going to set it self.value equals the value that's being passed in. Finally, your observable is going to need a function that helps bind the observable to a closure, to the listener, but the listener is defined as a closure in this case. And because that closure may exist beyond the bind function, right? It should, in fact, we have to label it escaping. And it's going to be the same type as the listener, which is a closure that takes our generic type and returns void. And when that function bind is called, we're going to do two things. We're going to say our listener is our closure now. And you'll see how we define the closure later. And then the listener is actually going to be called with the value of the value up here. Okay, good. So now I'm going to move this up here just so it's not so far out of the way there. Okay. Now we have our observable. Let's go actually implement our observable. Okay, to do that, first of all, we need to go to our view model and we need to make another attribute. So, or another property, right? Observable time. Observable time. And what's the type of this? This is going to be of type observable, but we know it's not going to be of a generic type. We actually want it to be of type string. So when we're initializing that, we're going to say it's an observable, and then you just go ahead and pass it an object. I'm going to say observable to kind of have my label change momentarily, at least before it starts updating, to the string observable to sort of say, hey, this is the observable label, right? And then in check time, we want to update that. So we're going to say observable equals, oh, now, okay, here, be careful. With all these others, we might say observable time equals combined time equals closure time equals, but observable time is actually not the string value itself. Observable time is the wrapped string value. So when we want to set it, we actually want to say value equals clock dot current time. And I think that's it that, oh no, we have to bind it. We have to bind it. Okay, let's go bind it. In our bindings, we're going to say view model dot observable time dot bind. And remember, bind accepts a closure. And you're going to hit enter one more time, and that's going to open up this block like this. And the string that we're binding is time. And all we want to do is we just want to say observable time label dot text equals time. And this is going to need a self too, because it's in a closure. I wonder. Make this an unowned reference to self too. Oh, yeah. Let's go ahead and make it unowned. All right, let's go ahead and run that, and let's see what we get. Boom. Now we have two bindings going, one that's observable and one that's done with closures. And now we're going to do one more. We're going to show you what it looks like when you do it with the combine framework. Now, the combine framework is kind of Apple's pre-built observable type. So it's not that different really than observable, except this is Apple's version. To do the combine one, we need to import combine. So we'll actually, probably best place to start is the view model. That's usually which makes the most sense. So let's go ahead and import combine. Okay. We're going to need a new property, except this time we're going to want to put this wrapper in front of our property called published, which just tells Swift that this is a published property. And we're going to call this combine time. And combine time is just of type string. And we can go ahead and initialize it to combine. And then right down here, we want to do combine time equals clock dot current time. That's really it for in here. Pretty simple. In here, we need to do a few things. First of all, we want to import combine again. And then we need a set. We need a new set called cancellables, or really anything, but it needs to be a set of cancellables, which we can define by doing this. And the reason Apple has us do this is because you want to keep a reference to the cancelable of the binding that you're doing, because Apple will take care of the canceling once the reference to it is deallocated. So it helps. They help with the memory management right up front when you make sure you retain a reference to the cancelable here in the cancellables. Okay. So we don't really need to do anything else special here except the binding. Let's do that. View model dot combine time, and this one's a little bit weirder. With combine time, we're going to put a $sign in front just to say we're actually seeing the publishable. And I've seen this constructed this way, in a little bit more of a Swift UI way. You do this. Now, right now, our combine time is an optional string. So just to make it not optional, we're going to go ahead and do a quick map on it and say string, basically turning every one into a non-optional string like that. And then we're going to, now here's where the combine stuff happens. We're going to assign it to a particular part of a view, I suppose how you would think about it. In this case, I want to attach it to the text attribute of the combine time label. And then finally, we need, like I said, we need to retain we need to retain a reference to the cancelable, right? So we do dot assign. Oh no, sorry, dot store, and we're storing the reference to this inside our cancelable. So we'll just say we should have an ampersand before that, like that. And that's the combine setup. So now we should have 3 clocks running: a combine clock, a closure clock, and an observable clock. There they are, all running. So that I will post this project on GitHub, so you can find it there if you were interested in looking at the code. But that's a quick way of doing 3 different bindings in Swift.